Edson was very fastidious about caring for his furs. One morning he came in from his trapline with 2 coyotes. He skinned them, but he didn't have enough time to flush and stretch them before school. Daddy said, "Leave 'em, I'll take care of 'em for you." Edson didn't think Daddy was careful enough with the furs, but just then the school bell rang, so he turned them over to Daddy with a last precaution. "Be careful!" In stretching the skins, Daddy pulled off one of the tails, and not knowing what else to do with it, he threw it away. When Edson came out of school at recess, he ran around to look at his hides. He came in the house fairly storming at his father. "You've ruined one of the hides! The tail's gone!" Then I, the peacemaker, came to the rescue. "Where's the tail?" I asked. "I'll sew it on and hide the stitches so they'll never show." Edson brought me the tail and went back to school, pacified, knowing Ma could fix it. I sewed the tail on as best I could, but it didn't look right. Something was surely wrong. I knew I'd hidden my stitches carefully, I thought. "Well, I've done the best I can. I'll just forget it." When Edson came out of school at noon, he went around to inspect my handiwork. He came in with a broad grin on his face and said, "You did a pretty good job, Ma. Your stitches don't show." Then, laughing outright, he said, "You sewed the tail on the belly instead of on the back." Well, no wonder it didn't look right. Then I went out and sewed the tail back where it belonged, and peace was restored. After we had acquired the desert claim, everything looked brighter for us. We were slowly but surely gaining. Our herd of cattle and horses was increasing, and we had a Model T Ford. I went into chicken ranching in a modest way, and also raised turkeys and geese for the market. One spring, a turkey and a goose both laid eggs in the same nest in an A-shaped coop. The goose went in to set in first and didn't leave the nest for days. I wanted to rescue the turkey eggs so they didn't spoil, but as a setting goose is a rather ferocious bird, I bided my time till the goose would leave the nest to feed. All the while the goose sits on the nest, the gander stands guard, making a formidable pair to disturb. Finally, I saw the goose come off to feed, and the gander still standing guard at the front of the coop. I called to Daddy to come with me and stand at the front of the coop to attract the gander's attention, while I got down on my hands and knees at the back of the coop to reach under and rescue the turkey eggs. But the old goose saw us and promptly came running back and got on her nest. As I reached in to get the eggs, she bit my hand unmercifully. Then the gander came around the back of the coop and bit and flogged me from behind. I took an awful punishment for a few minutes, but I succeeded in getting the turkey eggs. I looked up, and there stood Daddy at the front of the coop laughing. "Well, old lady," he exclaimed, "I wasn't a hell of an attraction, was I?" That spring, after heavy winter, Warm Springs Creek, which usually was a dry wash on the desert, became a raging torrent. Some bartenders in Reno, while driving through the desert, saw this big stream of water, and thinking the stream was always that heavy, they went in together and homesteaded 160 acres of land apiece. They built a big reservoir, dug a ditch from the creek to the reservoir, both in sandy soil, and then they broke out and planted 10 acres in alfalfa and wheat. They built a 5-foot chicken wire fence around their crop to keep out jackrabbits, and they built a 1-room cabin. Then they sent out an old opiate addict to irrigate for them and keep the water flowing through the ditch. We called the fella Goofy Frank, and the bartender's homestead was referred to as the Goofy Camp. It was never a success. For the first time the water was turned into the sandy ditch, the banks caved in and the water never reached the reservoir. Goofy Frank tried his best to repair breaks in the ditch, but it would no sooner get one place fixed when another would cave in. The odds were too much against him. The bartenders gave up after the first summer, and after spending thousands of dollars, they deserted the place. The name of the place was changed from Goofy Camp to Bartender's Dream. Later, we bought all they had to sell on their place, which amounted to a cabin and chicken wire around 10 acres of land. I had an amusing experience in buying the Bartender's Dream. It was during Prohibition days, and the bartenders had gone into moonshining. They had their still up on an almost inaccessible place on Mount Rose. We learned through the Sagebrush Telegraph that where they were located. One of them had written me that they would sell the house and wire for $100. We needed both. Edson went with me in our Model T Ford. We had some difficulty locating their cabin, and still among the thick pine timber on Mount Rose, but we finally spotted it. As we neared the cabin, we saw 3 men come out and take out across the timber at a dead run. Knowing they'd mistaken us for prohibition offers, we stepped on the gas and called their names. Hearing us, they turned and came back looking rather foolish, and the deal was quickly made. We had bought out another homesteader. About 1914, Eastern divorcees, or dudes as we called them, began to invade our outlying country, buying land. High sold out to one of them, moving his horses into Reno, and started one of our first riding academies in town. When I told Ogoshi of High's new enterprise, he shrugged his shoulders, saying, "Pretty good. High make good riding stable. He knows plenty about horses. He make it nice to the ladies. Sure, he make good." The woman High sold out to was a flighty divorcee. We had great fun watching the happenings up at the widow's that summer. First, she drove out in her new Cadillac with her 10-year-old girl and 12 canary birds in 12 different cages. Next, she added a milk cow and a few chickens. On another trip to town, she bought 200 head of fine young cows. Hiring some cowboys to help her, she drove them up on Tool Mountain, where there were thousands of acres of good grazing land. On her next trip to town, she got married to a straggly, bony-looking old gent. His name was Skaggs, and it fit him perfectly. We called him Old Skaggs from the beginning. In a week's time, they had a quarrel, and she took the children in the Cadillac, and away she went into town. Soon after she left, Old Skaggs hitched up the team and spring wagon and followed her, stopping first at our place to ask me to go up and do the chores while they were away. I said I would. I didn't mind feeding the chickens and milking the cow, but oh, those canary birds! I always felt sorry for a bird in the cage, and now I was afraid I'd forget to do everything that was needed to be done for them. When Mrs. Skaggs was there, she took great care of them, moving them around to sun and shade as need be. I didn't have much time to care for birds, so I pulled the big table out in the middle of the floor and placed all 12 cages on the table. Then I carefully fed and watered the canaries each day. The newlyweds soon made up and were back home in a few days. In a week or two, the same performance was repeated, and back I went to do their chores. The third time it happened, Mrs. Skaggs took Old Skaggs in the Cadillac with her. As they had both had him out of residence, they could get a divorce as easily as buying a bill of grub. That time she did get a divorce, and we saw no more of Old Skaggs. The widow, by this time, disgusted with the whole country, sold her cattle. The buyer brought out a bunch of horses and some cowboys, and they rounded up the cattle on Tool Mountain and drove them to town, all but 4 head, which they couldn't find. The merry widow stopped at our place and sold the remaining 4 head to me. That is, she'd sell them if I could find them. Daddy didn't want me to buy the cattle. "Why in hell," he asked, "didn't you tell her we didn't have the money to pay for them?" I did tell her that, but I also told her we'd have money by September when I sold our little herd of steers. I wasn't to pay for her cows until I found them and had them in my possession. It was a good deal. One of the cows proved to be a wonderful milk cow. We called her Old Skaggs. I had no use for another milk cow, but we had a neighbor 3 miles away who had a wife and 3 children, but no milk cow. We loaned him Old Skaggs, and the children drove her over to the homesteader's land. He was to raise the calf for us and have the cow bred. And then, when she went dry, our children would go over and drive the cow and calf home. Next spring, we would do the same thing over again. We drove Old Skaggs back and forth for 3 years. One time, while we were taking her to the neighbor's, Alice rode ahead, leading the cow, Jessie riding behind her, herding. About halfway there, Alice had a call from nature, and taking the dallies around the saddle horn, she dismounted. When she pulled her riding pants down, Old Skaggs got frightened and plunged ahead toward Alice's horse, wrapping the rope around Alice's feet. There was Alice, strung out in midair between the horse and a cow, with her pants down and her bare bottoms scraping along the gravelly road. How she escaped without severe injury is a mystery. When the girls returned home that evening, Alice drew a picture of the whole performance. She always illustrated her stories with pictures, and how I wished I had saved them. In the 3rd year, the homesteader bought Old Skaggs and kept her 3 years more. When he sold his place and moved away, he sold the cow to another homesteader over in Red Rock Valley, who owned her for 4 years. Then a hard winter came, and having no hay, he advertised his stock for sale. I drove her over in the Ford and bought the cows, 11 of them, including Old Skaggs. The cows were very poor and had to be moved immediately. The homestead was 25 miles from our place, across Dogskin Valley. I planned to go over the next day on horseback and bring him home. Next morning, Edson and I started out at 2 a.m., for we had a 50-mile ride ahead of us. We arrived at Red Rock Homestead about 10 a.m. After resting a while, we turned the cattle out and headed home. From the very first, old Skaggs took the lead. She traveled along the fence with her head down, sniffing the ground. When she reached the end of the homesteader's fence, she pointed her nose to Tool Mountain and made a beeline for home, with the other cows and Edson and I following her lively gait. Then, when we turned them into our meadow gate, she broke into a dead run, heading for the corral. She hadn't been home for 7 years. Such was an old cow's memory. We'd often heard of dogs and horses traveling great distances to reach home, but that was the first demonstration I ever had of an old cow's homing instincts. And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.